Susan Garrett. I'm the chair of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. Welcome to our forum on the results of the Illinois primary. I want to thank you for attending our event. I'm so excited to share this wonderful lineup of election experts, journalists, data scientists who are here with us today. As many of you know, ICPR is a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization advocating transparency, accountability in government in Illinois. Part of our mission is to promote participation in government, which leads us to our discussion today of the results of the 2018 Illinois primary. Many people are wondering what happened in the primary and how the outcomes will affect the general election in November. In this primary, we saw the formation of new winning coalitions on both sides of the aisle. There were also some surprising losses from well-known candidates to newcomers. As an example, in the House 1st District race, Aaron Ortiz beat 27-year incumbent Representative Dan Burke, and in the Cook County Assessor's race, Joe Barrios lost to Fritz Cady. The 2018 primary was also marred by early voting delays caused by ballot challenges and appeals. In some election jurisdictions, early voting was delayed up to 2 weeks. These delays created the opportunity for campaigns to air additional television ads before voters could head to the polls. Our experts here with us today will address voter turnout, the effects of campaign advertising, funds raised per vote, and more. At the end of our event, our panelists will be available for a Q&A session, so don't forget to think about questions you would like our experts to answer. We would like to thank the Chicago Board of Elections for generously hosting us in their space today. A few housekeeping issues. We will also be live streaming today's discussion on our Facebook page and tweeting photos and pieces of our event. You can join in by tweeting at ILCampaign with the hashtag ILPrimary18. You will find evaluation cards in your programs. Please take the time to fill them out. It gives us great information on what we need to do for future events. It's very valuable for us. Without further ado, I would like to invite our moderator and executive director, Sarah Bruni, to come forward and begin today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you all for being here. I see a lot of familiar faces, but also some new ones, and some students, which I'm really glad that so many students were able to join us today. We'll go ahead and get started. I think Susan summed up very well some of the things we're going to talk about today. So I want to get started by letting our panelists introduce themselves. So we'll start here with Jim, and you can just introduce yourself and your organization. Yes, take those both off the stand. And give us your take. What was the most interesting thing that you think happened in the primary? Just one. Technical difficulties.
Just one. Well, I would say that.
Who are you?
Oh, I'm sorry. Jim Allen. I serve as the spokesman or spokesperson for the Chicago Board of Election Commissioners. Former journalist turned county collector, assistant county collector turned public information officer for one of the biggest election agencies in the country. Elections are like children. Each one is special. And this one was remarkable in the sense that, in many regards, but one of them was that you typically expect turnout during the day to kind of start high, level out around the noon hours, and then pick up again in the evening rush. And we've seen variations on that, and we now have electronic poll books, which allow us to monitor this very closely throughout the day. And just to give you an idea, I don't know how well you can see that, but you can see at 6 a.m. was our lowest hour, and then it started to pick up a little bit more. But then in the evening hours, it really shot up so that we had twice as many voters voting per hour, 5, 6, 7 o'clock, than we did early in the morning. It was, this was a pattern that was consistent, not only with all precincts in Chicago, but also in precincts in suburban Cook County. So I guess we're a nation of sleepyheads. So.
I'm Matt Dietrich. I'm the Public Information Officer for the Illinois State Board of Elections. We are the agency that oversees campaign disclosure, and we certify the results of elections. We'll be doing that on April 20th for the March 20th primary. And I started in January, so this was my first election to go through with the Board of Elections. And I think the most interesting thing to me was that I came in right at a time that the board was concluding all of its hearings on ballot objections. And what I thought in the beginning would be a process of a couple of weeks extended well into the early voting period, and kind of became a problem that I think we'll probably be discussing some more here. That, and I think the popularity of early voting, we had about 440,000 early votes cast in the state, and that compares with about 200,000 in midterm elections of 2014 and 2010. So whether that is an indication that overall early voting is becoming more popular, or whether this was just a particularly hot election, will depend on when we have official turnout numbers, which we won't give out until April 20th.
Jaime Dominguez. I'm an assistant professor of instruction at Northwestern University in the Department of Political Science, and also with the Latino-Latina Studies program there. My expertise and research areas race and ethnic politics, political behavior, urban politics, immigration, and Latino politics. I guess for me, the main takeaway in this election is for someone that works with young people and who always strives to kind of encourage high levels of civic engagement and participation. I think it was a win-win for those individuals who support that. The fact that we're able to see new faces, but young people, I thought that was really good, and I think going forward, that's something that I would like to see more of.
Hi, my name is Scott Kennedy. I'm the operator of a website called Illinois Election Data, which is a hobby project I started a few years ago when I was back then getting out of politics, but like a moron, I've gotten back in. Mostly what I do is I steal the information from Matt and Jim and try to pretend like it's something new. For me, the most surprising thing I thought was, going into Election Day, I thought that the incumbent assessor, Joe Barrios, would lose the assessor's race. But still, the impact of that loss is probably the most surprising to me. I think it will impact the way that taxes are collected going forward, and then it will have a political ramification that will reverberate, as the party chair of the Cook County Democratic Party has lost. We could see changes within the power structure here at the local party. So for me, that was the most significant.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sherry Runner. I'm the president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League. For me, as a person who has been a lifelong Chicagoan, this race reflected many of the things or trends that we see as Chicagoans. We don't really know what's going on in the rest of the state and the rest of the world as it relates to what's really happening with our Republican counterparts, our Democrats, or because we live in this blue bubble of the city of Chicago. So for us at the Urban League, it's really critical that we educate voters not to be disenfranchised and not to think that things are just going to happen because they can count on their peers to go out and vote. And so I think that was an interesting story as the stories led up to the election and what the ultimate outcomes were.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. And all of you are ongoing partners for ICPR in some way, so I want to thank you for working with us, and especially for Jim and Matt. I know this has been a really crazy few weeks for you, so thanks for taking the time to be here with us today. So a quick roadmap for what we're going to talk about today. First, we are going to discuss the results of the election, talking about who won and why, and which regions of the state had the biggest impact on Election Day. After that, we'll talk about voter turnout and election administration. There was a lot of good work, but also some things that we need to discuss here, and I think some of that will come up in the Q&A as well. And then finally, we'll ask our panelists to make their predictions for November, and we'll talk about some of the pressing issues that are going to come up in the next few months. And then there will be Q&A at the end, so please do have your questions percolating. So first, let's talk about what happened at the polls on March 20th. There's a sense that there's some, machine politics in Illinois that is alive and well, and we sort of have a reputation for it. But it seems like that was somewhat threatened during this election, or faltered a bit. So do you feel that the loss of longtime party-backed candidates like Barrios, Dan Burke, does that show a weakening of the party power structure?
I'll take that one. I've kind of laughed at the notion of a machine over the last 10 plus years. We have a hard time. I see one of our election coordinators in the office, in the audience rather, and we have a difficult time finding judges of election. Now, decades ago, when there was a thriving, functioning machine, there were judges in every precinct who were there on time, were well-trained, experienced, and we are now, just like every other jurisdiction around the country, scrambling for poll workers on Election Day. So I think if anyone had predicted that 4 years ago, that the chairman of the Democratic Party would lose a primary for his own office, I don't think it gets any more significant than that. The notion that there's this well-oiled machine that's able to turn out the votes, it's not borne out by data. It's not borne out by our poll workers' experiences. I think there are a couple of apparatuses left around the city, but overall, I think there's an acknowledgement in how we're moving more and more toward early voting and vote by mail, where you do not have someone right there in your face as you're walking into the polling place. We've made a transition. And I just want to address something that Susan touched on. 40 days of early voting, it's time for us to admit this, it's a mistake. It was a cut and paste error when the lawmakers were putting that together. It was never meant to be 40 days. When we called them, they said, oh, sorry, man, we're on the third reading. There's nothing we can do. 40 days is a biblical number. It doesn't work for elections, okay? It's time in the desert. It's time on the mount. It's not early voting time. We were doing great with 15 to 22 days for many, many years. 40 days is unworkable, and this election is proof, again, of that fact. I cannot emphasize enough that our election jurisdictions around the state are all unanimously wanting to get this back in control, because early voting is a function of people having their minds made up. 40 days is too soon. People don't have their minds made up for all these little offices on the ballot. It's a waste of taxpayer money. It's a waste of, we don't have the facilities to offer it. Let's get it back. We still, even with 40 days, it goes like this. Low, 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 final week, up. So of the 100,000 that we did in the city of Chicago, probably about 75,000 were in the final week. Let's get that fixed.
Okay, we're going to talk about early voting. Are you trying to divert my
yes
well-laid plans? Agreement, disagreement on the machine. Is it dead? Is it alive?
I think it's, the machine has obviously changed from its original form in terms of being able to utilize mass resource, public resource in exchange for votes. In terms of on election day, you have mass showing up at the poll and voting. I definitely don't have that. I think the ways in which, the machine apparatus has definitely changed. I think I think that first district race that had Dan Burke in that particular race, I think what that race showed to me is the fact that the idea of just relying on just a select segment of voters to turn out habitually, I think that this showed that in fact other people who are not a part of that apparatus can get involved, can be incorporated. So I think, if anything, it just showed that if the word gets out, and this maybe early voting can be an advantage to newcomers, people who want to have greater access to the polls, that there's a lot of other ways that they can get involved, particularly for voters who may not show up to the polls as much as traditional voters, but particularly minority voters, particularly Latino voters. One thing that we saw in this last, at the presidential election, is that early voting really Latinos really showed up for the early voting. And so to me, it's the fact that if that's something that we can continue to do and educate people about that, I think we'll be able to have more competitive elections. And I think when we have that, that's great for everybody. These communities Chicago is a very diverse community. Even within the Latino community, it's a very diverse community. And I think that those voices need to be represented. So I think that this is a great opportunity maybe for particularly young people, I think, to get involved, right? And to show in fact that, elections are tough, and sometimes, you may not actually win, but you can create momentum. And I think also that in this primary, we also saw, at least at the local level, for example, Jesus Garcia's unsuccessful bid for the mayoralty in 2015, nevertheless, I think planted a seed of agency, I think that was non-existent. And I think the idea too, that they can believe that they can actually make some type of change if they get involved. It may not be this one election, but maybe it may take 2 or 3 election cycles, right, for that group to just see itself as being more competitive. So I think that's one way that the traditional machine, in terms of being able to just count on certain voters to come out and vote, I think, could be could potentially disappear.
I think Scott, did you have something?
No.
My next question was for you, Jaime. Do you think, so Chuy Garcia sort of organized a coalition, and he is seen as some of the force behind some of those incumbent candidates losing. Who do you think is his next kind of target, and do you think that he has a coalition to really change Chicago politics, or have a new order in Chicago politics?
That's a good question. I think, his coalition it's young. It's young in the sense that it hasn't been around long enough, but more importantly, I think he's going to have to build off of, I think, the visibility, I think, of Aaron and Anaya. We just got elected, but I think that he's going to have to go just beyond, Latinos. He's going to have to reach across different groups. We saw that in the 2015 mayoral election, right? He had, although he got about 20% of the African American vote, that had he increased his share of that, potentially that could have helped him to kind of expand his base. Also within white voters, I think that group definitely needs to expand and include that. And I think it's a challenge, particularly because of the fact that, if we look at just the way districts are made up in Chicago from a demographic standpoint, these districts where he's running these successful candidates are predominantly Latino. So, for those districts, I think not as much maybe work needs to go into in terms of expanding and diversifying his ideas and the people who want to be a part of that coalition. But it's going to take a lot of work, I think. But again, the fact that people just did not see this coming, particularly, Dan Burke, the fact that, for example, even in his brother's ward, 14th ward, he was only able to eke him up at like 62 votes. I mean, that in itself, I think, we were talking earlier about the control of the machine. I think that shows that it's not just, it's cracked, but there's a fracture there. And I think that there's, again, the opportunity to bring in more people, to create a more inclusive political environment for these non-traditional voters to come into the fray, I think is great for everybody.
Sherry, I want to know your thoughts. Do you feel that people in the communities you talked to felt connected to that kind of Garcia movement, or is there some kind of divide there in the city?
I think generally the turnout in Chicago and the county and Illinois is way too low. And I think that when we talk about millennials, especially young people, getting engaged in what is happening in the political process, which impacts their lives way more than it does anybody else, they're not engaged, whether it's Chewy or whoever. It is at a point now where the biggest thing that we're trying to do as an organization, as a nonpartisan organization, is to make sure that people know why it's important to vote for Attorney General. We saw with the last election, especially as it related to Kim Foxx and the state's attorney's office, how people got engaged and got out and got energized around an issue. So it's very important to me as we look at all of these coalitions, whoever they're run by, that people understand what is the basis for their vote. Why should they care? Why are they involved? What it means for them, because I think and these gentlemen know way more than I do about the demographics of the vote, but mostly people over 40 and over 50 are voting. People who are younger than that, whose lives will be impacted by the outcomes of these votes, are not voting in record numbers. And so this is so important to the African American community more than anybody else, that we demand that our legislators do what we elect them for. But in order to do that, they have to know what they're supposed to be doing and how we hold them accountable.
You talked about how generally the voting demographic is older. That's certainly true. We know that. We saw one congressional race that was a bit of a surprise, Marie Newman and Dan Lipinski. So Marie Newman was seen as sort of an insurgent candidate, new to politics, a more liberal candidate in that Democratic primary. Why do you think she came so close but was not able to ultimately overcome the incumbency advantage for Lipinski?
Yeah, that was an interesting race. I think a couple of things. First, I feel that there was this, obviously there was this, you got to put that race within the national context of in terms of this, this notion that this blue tsunami is coming in the fall, particularly with midterm elections, and the Democrats are hoping to take control of the House, at least if not the House of Representatives, not the Senate, but more than likely the House of Representatives. And so I think there was a sense of outsiders there may have been a perception of outsiders coming in because there was a lot of money, a lot of interest groups, lots of people were coming into this race. We're putting people on the ground, we're contributing to Newman's campaign. So I think that might have maybe encouraged or gotten people off the sofa who maybe thought, this is going to be kind of a local race, it's going to be the same voters. We don't want outside people kind of coming in. We may not like certain positions of Lipinski, but nevertheless he's been good for the district. So I think that's one thing. I also think that, again, trying to challenge a solid incumbent who's, his dad was there before him, and so he was really entrenched, and I think he had a solid group of voters that he could definitely count on. And I think Marie Newman, despite the fact that she was able to be extremely competitive and to get her message out and to actually challenge Lipinski to defend his positions, I think that it was still hard, I think, for voters to kind of, vote for change. Change is always difficult, and sometimes when you mention the word change, people are kind of uncomfortable. So I think then maybe this idea of getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, the next election cycle, she might, be able, or if it's not, whoever it is, right? At least I think the door has definitely been kicked open for someone that if they mobilize, once they can do all the research and figure out where the votes were coming from, where they weren't coming from, I think that the next person could potentially unseat Lipinski. Lastly, I also want to say that, a third of that district is also of Hispanic origin. So, and although Hispanics don't traditionally vote commensurate to the numbers in the population, when you have a competitive race like the one we just saw, I mean, just if you can get, 1,500 more votes, 2,000 more votes, that could tilt the scale, right? And so I think, again, that race really also presents an opportunity to expand the electoral coalition going forward.
So would you agree with that assessment, or anything to add?
Well, I think a couple things stood out to me in that race, and they generally had to do with electoral mechanics. You look at There was outside spending on behalf of Maria Newman, and then there was spending for Dan Lipinski. There was a little bit of outside spending, but he also had a significant financial advantage. He didn't start pressing that financial advantage until very late. We were watching media buys come in, and his buys were always very small, despite the fact that he had a considerable financial advantage. At the same time, we've gotten in the habit of talking about some legislative races, state legislative races here in the last couple cycles that are $3, $4, $5 million races. This federal race didn't have that kind of spending. So I don't know that the messages that were being pushed really sunk in until fairly late in the race. And then if you look at the areas where the vote made the difference, the areas that made the difference for Congressman Lipinski were in some of the Chicago wards, and they're in some of the Chicago wards that you traditionally think of as having some people affiliated with those wards who've been around for a long time. I know that Jim spoke about sort of the atrophy of the Chicago machine, but if he were to make a list of what are the wards that sort of have still some of that left over, it would be these wards. The 13th ward where Speaker Madigan's home base is, the 19th ward, which is on the far southwest side, the 23rd ward where Congressman Lipinski's father was originally his power base. I think if you look at some of those wards, those were where he ran up the margins, and those margins were what carried the day.
Great. I want to talk about some statewide races. So starting with the gubernatorial race, were you expecting a 20-point margin for J.B. Pritzker? Were you expecting it to be called so early in the night? I know I was on live TV when it happened, and a bit of a shock. I didn't think it would come in quite so early. Were you expecting that margin? Then were you expecting Dan Biss to be slightly ahead of Chris Kennedy, or were those surprises? Anyone? No surprise?
No. As an election administrator, the one thing that we pray for is distance, so I was just glad. We don't care who wins, but as long as there's distance between number one and number two in any given contest, that's really good for us.
Well, I know what you mean, because in 2014, the state treasurer's race went on and on and on, and it was a kind of a nightmare. I think there was a perception going into the gubernatorial election on the Democratic side. J.B. Pritzker, in any public polling that had been released or polling that had been released by the campaigns, he never seemed to be able to get over 50% despite spending probably almost $70 million in that race. And so there was this perception that when they looked at undecided voters, that undecided voters had made a decision that they weren't for J.B. Pritzker, they just didn't know who they were for. And I think when we saw the final election results, we saw that some undecided voters went to Chris Kennedy, some went to Biss, and some went to Pritzker. And I think that sort of assumption going into the race is what led to the misperception, and which led to some surprise when J.B. Pritzker ultimately won by the margin that he won by. As to the question of whether or not Chris Kennedy or Daniel Biss were more likely to finish ahead of the other, we saw some polling early on that had Chris Kennedy in a very strong position. Daniel Biss had a surge, and then that sort of fell off, and then it seemed like Chris Kennedy was making a surge late. He certainly had a very strong performance at the final debate, and I think that maybe we sort of read a little too much into that sort of back and forth. They finished very close to one another, which is sort of what the polling showed all throughout. And I think that they both made a very strong case. I just don't think that they ever made a case strong enough that was going to make up that difference. And I think that's just, the race sort of finished where it was a couple months ago.
Yeah. Scott, while you have the mic, there was a lot of talk. I want to get some data from you and then ask Sherry to weigh in. There was a lot of talk about the African American vote in the Democratic gubernatorial primary. A lot of people felt that Kennedy would receive a lot of that voting demographic because he's a known entity in that community. Where did the votes actually fall with African American voters in the gubernatorial race? And then Sherry, if you could speak to what you heard from people and kind of back that data up with anything you heard.
Yeah, back last summer, I had written a piece that was on my website where I looked at past performance of gubernatorial candidates going back to 94 and 1990. And what you'd historically seen is that the African American community, at least as you measure it in Chicago, it's sort of an approximation when you try to measure that. Typically in a contested gubernatorial primary on the Democratic side, the community itself will typically coalesce around one candidate. Sometimes it would be enough to carry that candidate to the nomination, not all the time, but it's probably somewhere between 25 and 30% of the Democratic primary electorate overall, so it's a very significant population. And I remember thinking late last summer that I was surprised that you didn't have the candidates making, you weren't seeing the excessive campaigning, not excessive, but persistent campaigning within that community. They seemed to be traveling downstate a lot, or they were downtown a lot, or they were going out to the suburbs, but there wasn't that strong play for that vote. In some past primaries, we've had a very strong African-American candidate, so you've seen some of that ground seated. In this particular race, we did not. And then ultimately what ended up happening was that J.B. Pritzker got a little more than 60% of the vote as measured in Chicago, using that as a proxy for the statewide vote, which is the best approximation that we have. And that was a little bit surprising in that he was playing defense towards the end of that campaign. You may recall that there were some private phone conversations that had been publicly made public where he and former Governor Rod Blagojevich were discussing some appointments, and they were using some phrasing that was less than flattering about various individuals, and so there was significant pushback. Pritzker doubled down. He wound up finishing with, in the low 60s. You look at the Attorney General's race where you had a very strong candidate in Kwame Raoul, who's African American. He also got in the relative low 60s in that race, and that was an 8-way race. But also in that race you had Sharon Fairley, who was capable of making a very strong candidacy there. So I think the takeaway is it's worth spending time in a Democratic primary in that community, because the community tends to coalesce around a single candidate, and in this case, it probably provided both of them with the margin that they needed to secure the nomination.
Sherry, I know that the Urban League did a whole voter education campaign, especially targeted towards African American voters. Can you tell us some of what you heard as far as if they felt engaged by candidates and if there was some consensus that you heard?
No, there was no consensus, and the fact of the matter is that the monolithic voting bloc of the African American voter does not exist. It's very, very dispersed, and I think that it would be wise to recognize that each one of the gubernatorial candidates made sure that they had a black lieutenant governor running mate as a part of their platform. So I think that's important to know. It was spread across age, who was looking at what candidate in terms of what they thought was important to their age group, and also who they identified with in terms of addressing their issues. And that's the point for us in this voter education campaign. We have done registration for years. The African American voting bloc in Cook County and in the city of Chicago is huge, but it doesn't necessarily vote all of the time. So we need to get people educated and energized and out to make sure that they know that these candidates are there and what is in their best interests, or what just are the issues in terms of voting and why they should be voting and why they should care. So I think those are the most important things.
Thank you. Let's talk about the Republicans briefly. Jaime, I'll give this to you first. Do you think that Governor Rauner took Judy Ives seriously enough as a candidate? And given how close that race was, what do you think he could have done to improve his margin?
First and foremost, I don't think he took her very serious. Obviously, he thought that she was just this kind of a disgruntled kind of Republican who just wasn't happy, maybe with his governance. But I think Rauner's going forward, I think, is in serious trouble in terms of just if you just look at his polling, just with the Republicans, he's not coming across as a strong candidate. I think also, whether you support him or not, but I mean, he came into a very difficult situation given that there was that budget impasse, and he came in, I think, and he's learning. He's on the job training in terms of trying to govern from a business standpoint. Sometimes it doesn't always work that way. Our current president is figuring that out. But you can't just always do what you want whenever you want and say take it or leave it. So I think that he's had a steep learning curve, but I don't think it's I think time's running out for him to kind of figure that out. So again, just going forward, I think the momentum is on the backs of Pritzker, and also just nationally, from a national context, I think that the Democratic tsunami that people keep talking about it's definitely going to, I think, even make it more difficult for Romney to really try to make a case, right, that he can govern effectively.
Any other thoughts on that?
So I would say in this time of information overload and speed, I don't think that people have time to learn on the job. And so if, in fact, there is an opportunity for you to pass a budget and then sort of move forward with knowing that that impacts everybody in the entire state, some constituencies more than others, then you need to get with it and do it. So perhaps, as you say, he did take for granted the fact that the things that he was doing were not going to be impactful because there was, again, a monolithic Republican vote that was going to stay behind the Republican candidate. And that's not the case for anybody in this environment with the amount of information that all of us are overloaded with any given day.
Great, and we'll get back to some of the November dynamics in a little bit, but I do want to talk about the administration of the election, and obviously pulling off a statewide election is something we have to do, and it's a giant undertaking, and I know Jim and Matt, you're both intimately familiar with all of the details. So first I want to talk about the turnout. We saw higher turnout this year on the Democratic side, especially, than some other primary years. Were you surprised by that turnout, and what do you think were the contributing factors to that?
No, we weren't surprised at all. In fact, we did something that we've never done before, and that was we wrote a letter to the editor that appeared in December, at the end of December in the Sun-Times, and we predicted that turnout would be significantly higher. We just didn't know how much higher because of the number of contests there were, especially on the Democratic side, but also on the Republican side. There were high-profile contests on the ballot. When that happens, your voters are more compelled to participate. They're more likely to feel their ballot choices can make a difference. And so we saw that at the governor's race, the attorney general's race, county board seats, congressional districts, all these things that we've been talking about, state rep, state senate, county assessor. Which is not normally something that gets people too excited about voting. All these things had an impact. We predicted it in December, and because the ballot is what drives turnout. No amount of outreach, no amount of begging, pleading, no amount of social shaming, anything is going to drive up turnout. It's, are the contests compelling? Might I be able to make a difference?
And like I said earlier, the state board, we don't deal with any figures until we certify the numbers, which doesn't happen until April 20th. But one thing we did have were the early voting numbers that I alluded to earlier. And one thing that's interesting is if you look at these gubernatorial year elections, in 2014, well, go back to 2010, the ratio on early voting was 60% Democratic to 40% Republican. You remember in 2010, we had a very hotly contested gubernatorial Democratic primary with Dan Hines and Pat Quinn. You also had a pretty strong race on, a pretty competitive gubernatorial race on the Republican side. So it was 60-40. In 2014, you really didn't have any, at the statewide level, it didn't have competitive, you had the incumbent Quinn running for governor, and Lisa Madigan as Attorney General. You really didn't have anything hot on the Democratic side. Very big race in the GOP gubernatorial primary, but the Republicans only accounted for 50% of early voting then, so it got up to 50-50, and then this year it was 75 Democratic, 25. So you can see kind of an ebb and flow, and I do have a suspicion that the official turnout numbers will probably reflect this as well. But it is interesting to watch, like Jim said, you can go back and look at the numbers and say, oh, what were the, how many really, really strong competitive races were there, and that's how you can kind of see what's driven the turnout.
So clearly turnout is driven by people feeling that their vote matters in a way. Do you feel that there's an overall trend towards early voting and mail-in voting, and how can we make that easier for voters, given some of the things that happened this year? How do you reconcile all of that?
Well,
Do you think it's too long right now? Early voting? Tell us about it.
Yeah, early voting could be shortened back to 2 weeks, maybe 3 on the outside, and we'd be fine. We'd be all fine as voters. But vote by mail really picked up this year. We did our first effort to take all the emails that we have in the voter registrations, and we get more and more as more online registrations occur. So we have about 300,000, about 1/5 of our voters we have an email address for. And we sent out an appeal and a link saying, hey, if you want to vote by mail, here's how you do it, here's how you apply. So we had 8,200 people in the last midterm primary and about 13,000 in the midterm primary before that who used vote by mail. This year we had just under 40,000. So we're going to try to push more and more vote by mail because it's convenient. We can send out another email to the voters saying, hey, your ballot is on the way. We can send out another email later saying, hey, your ballot's arrived, so you're good to go. Some people end up voting in person anyway. They just decide. There's a handful who do that, but more and more states that really see strong turnouts, they almost rely exclusively on vote by mail. Colorado is now the latest that just mails every voter ballot, period, end of story. 92% of their ballots are cast by mail, and Sarah and I have talked about this. We consult on legislation that she wants to pursue, but 92% of their votes in the last presidential election were either by mail or secured drop boxes. So even if you don't trust the mail, you can go to a local school or library where there's a secured drop box, and you can just drop it in there. And the signature is verified, and we have no excuse vote by mail now. If we're really serious about increasing turnout, I think that's something we're going to have to look at for the future.
We should probably add, I'm not sure, Jim alluded to it earlier, that this 40-day early voting period, that was a copy and paste error, and I'm not sure if you don't understand, this is a product of when what used to be called absentee voting was in-person absentee voting was rolled into the early voting system. Used to be that in-person absentee voting began 40 days out. When 2015, they combined everything, so it became everything was just early voting for 40 days out, not 15 days. So it would not require a huge, revolutionary change to go back to the old system. It was to the 15-day mark. But that was one of the unintended consequences of switching to the, we just kind of got everything lumped into the 40-day period.
Well, here, I have a question. Even if we were to, I have a question, I'm the moderator, so I'll go ahead and ask you. Even if we were to shorten early voting, by half, some of those ballot challenges that created the delay in early voting were ongoing at the time that the 15-day mark would have started. So what can we do to improve that ballot challenge system? And Jim, what did you learn from some issues that you guys had with notifying voters about that ballot challenge?
We've been through this before where we had a last-minute change by a court. In 2011, we had an award race, an aldermanic contest, where the appellate court came down with a last-minute decision taking someone off the ballot. But if you're just dealing with 40 polling places in one ward, that's a lot different than dealing with 3,600 polling places across Cook County in the city of Chicago, and 20,000 poll workers, and notices that you have to deliver and print well in advance of Election Day, and programs that you put in place like a text message. And then the appellate court in this case decided just 6 days before Election Day to put a candidate back on, countywide. We have to have the candidates file earlier. This was not a case that we managed. It was managed at the Cook County Electoral Board. There has to be better case management so that these things, if they're going to go to court, they go to court sooner. So, if we can move up the filing deadlines and we can avoid this conflict, that would be beneficial.
Do you think there should be more rules on how election jurisdictions should proceed as far as notifying voters or what they should be doing during those situations?
No, I don't think we need more rules. I think we need better decisions sooner.
Okay, so shorten the ballot challenge process, move the filing deadline up. That's what you, other thoughts?
Or you could make the primary later. Combination of everything. You just want to make a longer space for the court cases to take their course.
Does any of the other panelists, do you see an issue with potentially moving candidate filing deadlines earlier in the year? It's sort of a party cultural thing that you stand in line on Thanksgiving and they send people down there, wait for days. Would there be issues of changing that?
No, I don't think so.
Let's do it then.
Yeah.
Great. The last thing I want to talk about as far as election administration is voting equipment. So there were some issues in DuPage County with voting equipment. Matt, do you feel that there are adequate testing systems in place to catch these kinds of issues, and what can we do to stop that from happening in the future?
The DuPage situation, as it was described to me, was kind of a fluke where it was when the voting is done, you insert an ender card to close things down, and they had the card stock was too thick. It was an error from the printer, not a malfunction with the equipment, but just something that happened.
But should they have tested that prior and known about it?
I am not there on the ground with them to know. Jim might know better, but I believe that all of that does get tested usually beforehand. We've got a really extensive process that's laid out on our website for what we put the local jurisdictions through as far as testing in advance and then doing a random retabulation after the election, all kinds of things like that. In this particular case, I'm not sure that I know enough to know, was it tested beforehand with the correct card stock and then they just happen to have this?
Well, should there be more oversight of that process on a statewide level?
Living in a glass house, I'm not about to throw a stone at my friends in DuPage County. I think they have a problem, but we also have to look at ourselves culturally. We are very impatient. If we don't get election results by 8:30 p.m., something's wrong. Something's being hidden from us. And I remember before I was in the election business, being up until 4 in the morning. 2000, watching Florida flip back and forth, and it was going to take however long it's going to take. We're in a really weird business when you think about it. We set up 2,000 franchises, and let's say you're doing this in banking or burgers or whatever, and you're going to bring in all part-time workers to staff these 2,000 franchises, do all of your business on one day, and before any accountants or auditors come in, you better go show us how many burgers you sold, how many fries, how many shakes, how many whatever, within an hour. And you better have it accounted for and done accurately within an hour. So DuPage, in my opinion, got a bad rap. Could they have tested it? Yeah, I'm sure they tested the equipment. The equipment worked all fine all day. There was nothing that went wrong in DuPage with the actual balloting system, and isn't that the most important thing? There were some tense moments where they had a difficulty in transmitting results. The results, there was no mayhem there.
I think that you do bring up a good point about the fact that votes were not changed, and we're not talking about a Russian situation, but I think it's an issue of voter confidence. People want to feel that the process is going smoothly. They want to know that things are on track. So, Matt, do you think that there's more oversight that could be put in place that would help prevent this type of thing in the future? Is the state board involved in the local equipment testing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the state board is involved. I don't think that more oversight is the answer on these kinds of things. And not to go down too long of a side trail here, but when I first came on board with the State Board of Elections, it was in January, and I got hit with a wave of national media calls, because this was at the time when the Department of Homeland Security came out with this statement that numerous states had been targets of hacking by the Russians. And of course, Illinois had been hacked. We had a data breach in the summer of 2016 with our statewide electronic voter database. We caught it, we fixed it. Our executive director last year testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee about how we handled it. We were kind of considered a model of it. But the problem was that had to do with our voter registration database that we maintain for all the local authorities. The message that started getting out, this began in the fall when DHS made its first statement about Russian efforts to hack state governments and systems and election systems. By the time I took this job, the national narrative had been, the Russians are hacking voting systems. The Russians are hacking elections. And so I took a lot of calls from national media and had to explain to them, when you're talking about cyber security and hacking, and you're talking about what happened in Illinois, that had to do with our electronic voter registration database. That's not cyber hacking. That's not the Russians getting into your local precinct and stealing votes. And none of that equipment is on the internet. And it was a big effort, a message that I had to get across to a lot of media who frankly I thought should have known better, that we're dealing with two different things when you talk about cybersecurity and security and integrity in the actual voting systems. That's when you get into our testing process. We do a random 5% retabulation after the election to find out if there was any malfunctioning equipment. Every single vote in Illinois has a paper trail attached to it. If worse came to worse, we could go back to count the paper ballots. So anyway, that's my tangent that
I wasn't going to bring up the Russians, but I suppose it's the elephant in the room. So.
Well, anytime the Russians come up, I feel obligated to explain the difference between what happened here in 2016 with the Russians and what goes on in your local polling place.
Are there specific, this is my last election administration question, are there specific security measures the board is taking to mitigate any security issues that might come up for the November election?
We have cybersecurity, what we believe to be, best practices for cybersecurity. I'll go back to when the breach happened. That was in July 2016 is when we caught it. Beginning in October of 2016, the Department of Homeland Security has been performing weekly cyber hygiene scans on our electronic voter registration database to look for vulnerabilities. They've never found any. We're awaiting another DHS risk assessment that's the highest grade of security testing that they do. That's coming up. So, and we put in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 incident, we put in place new firewalls, new hardware, new software. We have a lot that's in cybersecurity that's always been built into our budget, but the answer that I give, because I've gotten the question a lot, do you feel safe? How safe do you feel? How at risk do you feel? And you never feel totally safe, and I'm sure that every institution that's ever been hacked felt like the day before it happened that they were doing all that they could to prevent it. And it's just a constant state of vigilance.
That's Blake. No, I appreciate it.
Well, we feel reasonably confident that the systems are 100% secure, reasonably confident. But we're taking steps all the time to try to ramp that up. Back in the room is, I should mention, Cook County Clerk David Orr. His office and our office are working on having jointly funding a cybersecurity expert to have that on staff. We are meeting continuously with Department of Homeland Security, with the FBI, with the Justice Department. So we're constantly looking at and trying to monitor and mitigate against any possible threats to the voting equipment. Next, we're also a part of a multi-state information sharing program, MSISAC. So we're constantly monitoring different incoming reports of threats to computer systems. Lastly, and most importantly, it's time to replace our rickety voting equipment. It's not just a matter of security, but also transparency. We're really excited about the possibility with any of the voting systems out there that have the capacity to allow our voters to see 100% audit if they so choose, where the scanners actually capture a scanned image of each ballot as it was being cast, so that you have the ability to allow the voters to examine, if they want, all 100% of the ballots. You can share those scanned images from the polling place. So we're excited about that, but it's going to cost us money. It's going to cost us money. There's $380 million that are in the pipeline from the federal government that Congressman Quigley helped secure in that recent spending bill that passed. But and that's going to amount to roughly $13 million for the state of Illinois. Cook and Chicago might be in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 million. That's help, but it's not at all enough to finance what's probably going to be, between our two agencies, about $60 million worth of new equipment, whether we're leasing it, buying it, something in between. So if we can get the equipment replaced, that would be a boon to both security and transparency.
Thank you. And I should note that many states have already replaced their voting equipment, and we have not. Sherry, did you have something to add?
Yeah. Just quickly, from the perspective of many voters who feel disenfranchised from the system, that even before we get to the point where votes can be counted, whether or not they're eligible to vote and what happens as they approach the whole system is an important factor that perhaps doesn't cost millions of dollars to fix, but that we need to think about as a broad range issue for especially African American voters and Hispanic voters too, who have fought very long for the right to vote just generally. So it's a very important piece of thinking about voting and the ability to get your vote counted.
Thank you, Sherry. We're almost to audience Q&A, but I want to ask a couple questions about November. First, the big one. Our parties in Illinois are seeing a trend that's on the national level as well, where there are some fractures in the party. There is the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party that may have supported Biss or Kennedy. There's also the Jeanne Ives, Dick Uihlein Republicans. Do you think that our two candidates can get those groups to coalesce behind them, Pritzker and Rauner? Who do you think is going to have the harder time doing that?
Kind of hard, difficult to predict. I think the Democrats are going to have a challenge, and just in terms from an optical standpoint, in terms of what the way in which Pritzker's campaign was ran and the amount of outrageousness of the money that what both candidates put in to come across as a progressive who cares about bread and butter issues. So I think that's going to present a challenge for them between now and November to kind of rephrase that messaging to try to maybe attract or to get those voters who are kind of on the edge or not sure of is the Democratic Party really going through this kind of issue kind of transformation. And so I think this idea of trying to not project an image that Pritzker represents the top 1%, yet he's going to embrace the democratic ideals of equal opportunity, social justice issues, things that obviously Bernie Sanders and his supporters obviously have really kind of have been pressing that. And so I think again you do have kind of a minor kind of balkanization within the party. So you definitely are seeing the groups splinter. But again, I think that it represents just, I think also just a party in transition.
Anyone else?
On the Republican side, we saw an incumbent Republican governor come very close to losing a Republican primary, and his challenger, still supporting some hard feelings, has refused to endorse him. She said she'll vote for him, she won't endorse him. I think the strength of her candidacy was based on some elements within the Republican Party feeling that Bruce Rauner had abandoned them or otherwise not supported issues that mattered most to them. So he has a significant amount of effort he has to put in to getting his own party to coalesce around him. If you think back to 4 years ago, he won the gubernatorial race over Pat Quinn by 4 points. He ran against an unpopular incumbent. This time he's the unpopular incumbent. He ran in an election year where the Republicans had it was a national wave for the Republicans. This cycle, it's definitely not going to be a wave Republican election on behalf of the Republicans. It might be for the Democrats, or it just might be a narrow support for the Democrats. So you look, his margin for error is so much smaller than it was 4 years ago when he won by 4 points. And I think he has got a lot of work ahead of him to put the coalition back together that he needs to win in November.
Thank you. Jamila, can you join us up here for the audience Q&A? I think we need to switch microphones. How do you want to do this? While we're doing that, Sherry, I'm wondering, we've seen a few mayoral candidates announced for 2019. We've gotten Paul Vallis, Gary McCarthy, and of course, Rahm. How has that been received by members of the Urban League, and what have you been hearing?
I'll repeat, the Urban League is a nonpartisan organization. We don't endorse candidates, but I think that...
Okay, so I think there are some very important issues that face the African American community in the city of Chicago. The most notable one, of course, is violence in our communities, but that's also layered on to education. It's also layered on with jobs. So I think there's an opportunity for a mayoral candidate to come out and talk about issues that are very important to the health, well-being, and sustainability of African American communities. And the Urban League wants to encourage a healthy debate and wants to make sure that those issues are included as a part of any mayoral candidate's platform.
Thank you. All right, let's start this Q&A. Let's embark on this journey together. Questions only, 1 minute or less. Please, I implore you. Jamila, you can start over here with.
Thank you. Hi. Okay, so quickly, I have a lot of feelings about this election. My mom ran for state rep. In the 28th district against Bob Rita, who put up a ghost candidate. Totally unethical, totally ridiculous. It was a friend of a friend, whatever, a longtime family friend. He put on the ballot to siphon votes or to quote unquote split the female vote. Tricking voters. I want to get your thoughts on that, on the whole concept of trickery in the elections and how we can get beyond that and enhance the ethics.
It's difficult. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Well, I mean, that's always been the case. I mean, in the Chicago, not just Chicago, I'm from Los Angeles, Virginia. I mean, this idea of using trickery to, whatever word you want to use to trick people into thinking that this is a candidate, that fits this profile or it doesn't fit this profile. So I think, how you can kind of combat that, I guess, again, is just, as, this idea of, I think, trying to educate voters about who these individuals are early on. Obviously, if you're an incumbent, you have a war chest, you can kind of control kind of the messaging and control kind of what they paint a picture, right, to your advantage of how the candidate is different. I think that that's, again, something that is always going to be present, so long and particularly as we allow massive amount of money, I think, to flow into these elections. But, it's difficult.
You had a question over here.
Thank you so very much. My name is Dilara Saeed, and I actually had the honor of being a candidate and was proud to see a name like mine on the ballot. And my question has to do with what you just mentioned, Heidi, is the amount of money that is in campaigns. And how do we help voters understand when a candidate is getting $50,000, $40,000 in PAC money one after another, and their total war chest becomes $1 million when they've raised maybe $20,000 from individuals, versus another campaign bringing in from 600 people or 700 people, because in my race that became a really big deal. And that kind of money pays for a lot of negative campaigning, right? You can say all kinds of things, mailers, ads, and all of that. And so that was a big deal, and I know it was a big deal for many campaigns throughout Illinois. What are your thoughts on reform for money in campaigns?
Just one thing I would say is just this idea has been floated out there, this idea of having the public kind of finance some of these campaigns. I think that's something that we definitely need to move in light of just Citizens United and the ways in which that money kind of flows into from federal to state to local. I think from the outset that might be a way to kind of combat that. That's going to have to require kind of a cultural shift, because people think if you want to run for office, you should do it yourself. The public should not be involved in trying to help you in terms of framing your message, etc. So I think that's probably a mechanism that I think would be beneficial to everyone in terms of at least widening the pool and allowing people to just compete more equally. That's all, because I think all people want is just to be able to kind of start at or near the starting line, right? And not be, 2 laps behind, because you're never going to catch up. You can't, because the money continues to flow, and it's just a steep hill you're going to be climbing. So I think that might be one way in which we can begin to kind of change that in terms of, again, being able to just widen the pool and create more equal opportunity for people, non-traditional people to vote, to run, and to get voters who, like you said, for the first time see somebody that's different and looks like them and maybe speaks like them, and they have ideas and they can be competitive.
And ICPR has advocated a small donor matching system, which is a small form of public financing that's not as expensive as fully financing the campaigns with public dollars. So essentially what it does is matches small local donations with some public money. And because that's a benefit for the candidates when they opt into that, they also can be restricted in where they get their money from. So you can say no corporate contribution